speaking with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy over the phone for the first time since Russia launched its war in Ukraine, saying he'll send a peace envoy to Ukraine and other nations, according to Chinese state media. Beijing hopes to act as a mediator amid Russia's war with Ukraine, and China has tried to appear neutral in the war but has refused to criticize Moscow's invasion. We now want to bring in Etienne Soula. He's a research analyst with the Alliance for Securing Democracy. He's joining us this morning from Brussels. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, Etienne. I first want to get started by just asking your reaction to hearing about this envoy being sent to Ukraine.
Thank you for having me, Luca. And I think, honestly, to give credit where credit is due, it is a positive development that the call did take place and that China has taken this commitment to send an envoy and as well as to not add fuel to the fire, which I think most reports interpret as meaning that it would not provide weapons to Russia. So that part is quite positive.
Now, it's taken quite some time even to be able to get these two leaders on the phone together. What do you think was stalling there? What was kind of, and then what eventually bridged the gap?
So that's, I guess, where the positive notes ends, because really China, since day one of the invasion, has been supporting Russia. We've termed it kind of pro-Russian neutrality, where ostensibly China says it's neutral, but in fact, in particular in the information space, Chinese diplomats and state media have been echoing Russian talking points throughout the world, and particularly in the global south, in Africa and Latin America, and really helping legitimize Russia's position. So I think that would be a big explainer on why it took so long for China to do this.
And China for a while has been really tiptoeing around this conflict, trying to stay neutral while also maintaining its friendship and also making it very vocal that they are still very friendly with Russia. In terms of how the Ukrainians are thinking, there's been many discussions from especially Western leaders attempting to convince Moscow to pull out, to stop this assault on Ukraine. What do you think China will be able to accomplish that perhaps Western diplomats have not been able to?
That's a hard question. I think it's very obvious that China and Russia have been, the relationship has been improving there. Last month, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin met in person in Moscow, and it was very clear from the images that came out of the meeting that the relationship there is going quite well, and I can imagine that Beijing is quite keen to keep this good relationship with its northern neighbor, in particular as competition with the US and its allies intensifies. So it will be a difficult balancing act for Beijing, basically, to pressure Moscow or to try to get Moscow to downgrade its aggression without jeopardizing this friendship that I think is very precious for Beijing.
For China, what does this mean to essentially have this type of a relationship with Ukraine and to be essentially kind of at the spearhead of attempting peace negotiations between these two countries, which it appears Western nations have struggled to be able to do?
So this is very clearly part of China's more broader diplomatic push to portray itself as a responsible, global power that favors peace, and that would maybe be a good alternative to the US and its allies in terms of global governance. I'm not sure that that China's efforts to portray itself as a neutral mediator can be successful, though, given what I mentioned earlier about their consistent support for Russian talking points and Russian positions since the outbreak of the conflict. However, I think it's very important for China to keep up, at the very least, appearances in its efforts to woo Europe and to try and drive a wedge in the transatlantic alliance.
And you say appearances because you've done quite a bit of research into China and its impact on a global scale and some of the efforts that it's really had in terms of interference in foreign governments, correct? Can you talk to me about some of that research you've done there with the Alliance for Securing Democracy and really what it means in terms of, you know, how is China seen on the world stage as, you know, in diplomacy terms?
Absolutely. So, I mean, it's very clear that competition between China and the United States in particular is intensifying, but with the possibility of a conflict erupting over Taiwan, China is trying to shore up support. And so it's been doing that in the global south, but also by trying to weaken the alliance between the United States and Europe. So you had the trip, Macron's trip to China last week that was quite successful for China. Unfortunately for Beijing this weekend, the Chinese ambassador to France came out saying that China didn't recognize the sovereignty of former Soviet states, which of course created a huge ripple effect throughout Europe with a lot of Central and Eastern European countries being very upset and essentially China losing all the benefit it had from the Macron trip. So I also see this call to Zelenskyy as a way for China to kind of, you know, if not reset, at least regain some ground in its relationship with Europe.
The impact on China's decision to do that, and in terms of its support for Russia, in terms of the decision of not recognizing sovereignty of former Soviet states. I mean, there has been this, at least speculation that Vladimir Putin, at least in some form or fashion, is attempting to reunify some of the former states, obviously Ukraine being one of them in this latest attack. How does that then, does it embolden Russia? What happens in terms of that kind of identification on a world stage?
Well, what's very clear is that Russian state media was very happy with the Chinese ambassador in France's statement. I think they called it very modern. China itself has had to go into damage control and has taken down the transcript of the interview. They've issued a public statement saying that this was just the ambassador's personal views and did not reflect in any way China's position. But in a way, the harm is done. And, you know, the ambassador who pronounced these words is still in post. So it's hard to see that, it's hard to convince Central and Eastern European countries of China's good faith efforts to be a neutral mediator in the crisis when it leaves an ambassador that says something so outrageous in his position.
Now, getting into one of my final questions, what do you think it will take to broker peace in Ukraine? What do the Ukrainians want, which I believe is perhaps most important in ending this conflict, because they in fact are the invaded in this case?
I think it's important to, you know, not make false equivalences between Ukraine and Russia, which is what China has been doing a lot. It often talks about the legitimate security concerns of all countries involved. So kind of drawing this false equivalence between Russia, the aggressor, and Ukraine, the victim of aggression. It's very clear that, you know, Ukrainians are still determined to keep on fighting. They want to regain the territory that they lost. And I think it's difficult for other countries, whether it be China or even Western countries, to try and impose conditions on Ukrainians if, you know, they want to continue fighting for their territorial integrity.
And at this point, given all of the fighting, all of the lives that have been lost, do you believe that that geographically includes Crimea?
So this is really, you know, outside of my expertise area, since I really focus on China's actions. I think the international, you know, consensus is that Crimea is a part of Ukraine. And again, if the Ukrainians are determined to keep on fighting, it will be very difficult for other countries to make that determination for them.
Absolutely. Etienne Soula, any closing thoughts before we let you go?
Thank you very much for having me. It's been very interesting talking with you.
I appreciate it. Very contextual answers there from Etienne Soula. He's a research analyst with the German Marshall Fund's Alliance for Securing Democracy. Thank you so much for joining us early this morning over there in Brussels, Belgium.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. All right, folks, we're going to go ahead and move on this morning to our first commercial break of the hour, 8:11 on the East Coast, 5:11 over on the West Coast. We'll see you back here in just a couple of minutes.